I'm only 19, and I've honestly experienced enough scary and traumatizing things for 2 lifetimes. That being said, I'm very street smart and always have been. I live right in front of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. This particular story happened when I was in 8th grade. Names have been changed for obvious reasons. My friend Jess threw a little Halloween party at her house on the night of Halloween. There were 4 other girls as well as 2 guys besides me and Jess. Megan, Cara, Emily, Bella, Chris, and Zach. Everything was going just fine, and we all took pictures in our costumes, and then took Jess's little cousin trick-or-treating around the neighborhood for a while. I'd also like to add that this was in a decent neighborhood, and crime doesn't really happen in this area. After taking her cousin trick-or-treating, we went back to Jess's house and grabbed hoodies since it was getting cold out, and we decided to walk around. Jess grabbed her Beats pill, and the 8 of us walked around the neighborhood together with the music on low, just barely enough to hear it unless you were near. We didn't see anyone out trick-or-treating anymore, so we decided to go park near Jess's house. It was about 9 o'clock or so at this point, so it really wasn't too late at all. The playground and the swings were at least 50 yards from the sidewalk, and you had to walk through a large open field in order to get to it. The playground was hidden due to a bunch of large trees surrounding the playground. You would really only be able to see it if you were walking on the sidewalk or in the trees. Once we got to the playground, we all put our phones and Jess put her Beats pill on the park bench, and we headed straight to the playground to just hang out. Everybody was all having their own individual conversations with one another, considering there were 8 of us. I was sitting next to Cara and Jess on the playground, while Mega, Emily, Bella, and Chris were sitting on those bars/walls of the playground. Zach was the only one not on the playground. When we all briefly glanced at a group of men with their hoods up, coming right out of the trees near the sidewalk that was about 40 yards away. They weren't doing anything, but they were beginning to walk along the sidewalk that we were just on before. We didn't really think anything of it, so we just minded our business and continued chatting amongst each other. About a minute or so later, everybody gets quiet, and Cara jumps up randomly and begins running off the playground. Roughly 2 seconds later, I see Megan, Bella, Emily, Chris, and Zach all gone and out of sight. Jess and I were sitting on the playground, a bit hidden, and were very confused as to what was going on. I then turned around, and I saw either 5 or 6 men, all dressed in black, each wearing masks, all with long knives or metal baseball bats in their hands. They weren't running, but they were walking very fast towards us. I knew there was something wrong the second I saw their demeanor, almost like they were up to something. And for anyone asking how I knew they were men, they were very tall and had a really big build underneath whatever they were wearing. I looked at Jess, and she was just as scared as I was, considering all our friends had left us behind without even saying a word. The men were right next to the park benches that we had left our phones on, still walking fast. And Jess, not thinking clearly, decides to run up to the park bench and grab her Beats pill, out of fear that they were going to steal it. I waited for her, because I knew I couldn't live with it if she got caught by them. At this point, Jess starts running back towards me so we can get the hell out of there. Jess and I start panicking on what to do or where to go because this park is so secluded and all we're surrounded by is trees. I turn to see where my friends went, and I see a couple of them climbing rocks that led to a fence that basically has nothing but forest behind it. That's when I then see a couple of the men start chasing after them on the rocks, and I instantly had to think because I knew that the other men were coming up right behind Jess and I. Jess and I ran towards the end of the fence because we knew we wouldn't get up the rocks fast enough. Jess immediately made it to the other side of the fence where our other friends were, while I, being the 4'11" girl that I am, was absolutely struggling to get over the fence. I looked to my left to see where the men were, and 2 men were sprinting right towards me as they noticed I was struggling to get over the fence. And I swear, maybe 5 seconds before one of the men caught up to me, I was actually able to make it over. At this point, I didn't know where anybody was, and I was all alone. I could see the 2 men getting ready to hop the fence to come after me, and that's when I took off running. I tried to stay low though, because I knew that the other 3 men were still around somewhere, and I didn't know if they had my friends or what the hell was going on. My first instinct was to find the first house I could with the lights on, and luckily enough, it wasn't long before I did. I ran straight through their backyard and then started pounding on their door, without a single care in the world of how creepy that must have been for them. Luckily, they were having a party too, and after I explained the whole situation quickly, the guys in that house went out into the trees to go find these men and go look for my friends. All of my friends and I were safely at this house by this point, but the men that went to go look for them weren't back yet. The ladies in the house called the cops and explained the situation, and about 5 minutes later, the guys from the house came back, and one of them had actually been punched in the face. The cops eventually arrived and checked everywhere we had been. They didn't even see anybody walking in the area, but they did find all our phones still sitting on the bench where we left them. This might not be that scary to some, but it was truly terrifying for me and those I was with, considering we weren't bothering anybody. One of the guys trying to help us got punched. They all had weapons of some sort, and they clearly weren't trying to rob us or they would have taken our phones that were right there. I never found out who those men were or what their intentions were with their weapons. All I know is I never went to a park late at night ever again. And neither should you.
Back in the day, I used to work for the National Trust up in Scotland. It was a really lonely job, with a lot of it spent either driving long distances or walking around the highlands in dire weather conditions. At work, I used to drive around this big 4x4, but off-duty, I had to use my own car, which was absolutely crap. So this one Saturday, I planned to drive back down to England for my mom's birthday. Me and my boyfriend had this whole big thing planned for her. I'd drive down in the morning, help get set up, then I'd go and pick Mom up for the big surprise. I was massively excited about it, and massively confident that my mom would be over the moon with it. What I wasn't confident about was the ability of my poor little Nissan Micra to get me there without giving me trouble. I was driving through the highlands, absolute arse end of nowhere and all, and the engine started making some really unhealthy noises. I pulled over to the side of the road, but I couldn't work out what was wrong. I thought I'd be able to get it to a garage and risk being a little bit late, but when I got back in my car and tried starting it up again, nothing. The engine was trying to turn over, just never coming to life, and no matter how hard I tried or what little tricks I tried to pull, I just couldn't get the car to start. These days, I'd have just pulled up an app and had a bloke out for repairs or a tow within an hour or so. But back then, in the age of flip phones and spotty mobile reception, breaking down in the middle of nowhere could be a huge pain in the bottom. I tried the engine a few more times while mentally preparing myself to actually get out and walk. This was in the middle of November, by the way, so it was absolutely freezing as it was, but then the Highland gales meant the idea of walking anywhere was grim beyond belief. I fought it for as long as I could, but in the end, I fastened up my coat, whacked on my hat and gloves, and got out of my car to face the cold. The plan was to walk to the nearest anything, which hopefully had a phone or someone capable of engine repairs, but then no sooner had I started walking, but a car suddenly appeared in the distance. Each side of the road was lined with trees, and the road kind of snaked off in the distance, so the car's appearance took me by surprise at first. I actually said a prayer to myself that whoever it was would pull over for me, and when they did, I thought those prayers had been answered. But at the risk of sounding a bit melodramatic, I don't think it was God that answered my prayers that day, rather than his opposite number downstairs. Anyways, the car pulls over and this quite friendly-looking middle-aged man rolls down the window and asks if I'm all right. I explain the situation, tell him where my car is, and he says that depending on how bad the damage is, he might be able to get his mate to come and fix it on the cheap. I just about danced a little jig that I was so happy. Then he invites me into his car and gives me a lift back to mine. We made a bit of small talk after I noticed his English accent, and we both swapped stories explaining why we were both up in Scotland. After we pulled up behind my car, he pulled out his mobile and started texting someone, apparently the person who was going to come fix my car. When I asked him, he explained that up in the Highlands, it was much better to send texts with that little signal you could muster. It was a little slower in terms of response time and all, but the message actually went through loud and clear instead of garbled and spotty. He told me not to worry though, as his mechanic friend worked Saturdays and was probably close to a phone. Those of you in your 20s might not remember the ritual of holding your plastic brick of a phone high above your head to try and force a text message through, but after a minute or so of that, my Highland Samaritan assured me that the text had both been received and read. Everything was looking hunky-dory. All I had to do was to be patient and hope for the best. Within a few minutes, the kind stranger's phone had buzzed, and he reported that his mate was on the way, although he wouldn't be arriving for another 20 minutes or so. 20 minutes I could deal with, and if the guy could get me to my mom's surprise party on time, the one I'd spent a month planning, I was willing to give him everything I had in my wallet. But then, as I sat waiting with the bloke, still making the same small talk, I noticed that he changed some minor detail in his story. I won't bore you with the ins and out of it, but he basically told me his business was in one place, and then about 10 to 15 minutes later, he told me it was based somewhere else. I didn't jump on the sudden change of detail or anything. I mean, a business can have more than one branch, can it? And people misspeak all the time, so I'm not exactly going to act all Sherlock Holmes on a bloke who's supposedly doing me a favor, am I? That was the first red flag, you might say. One I didn't really acknowledge until after the event itself. It was only the second that actually caught my attention. After a brief lull in the conversation, the man asked if anyone was expecting me. He used that exact same phrase too, expecting you. And I must have given him a funny look or something because he clarified with, have you got any plans later? I started telling him about my mom's party, how I'd been planning it for ages, how my whole family expected me to be there. And instead of showing any interest or enthusiasm whatsoever, he sort of nodded and started staring off into the distance like he was thinking about something. That wasn't what got me though. It was how he'd phrased the question. Was anyone expecting me? And then considering he was apparently just bringing his mate to fix my car, and I hadn't heard what they'd said to each other. It all added up to a really bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. Call it a woman's intuition, but I knew I had to do something, anything to try to get ahead of what I feared the most. I asked the guy how long his mechanic friend is going to be, and after his long and contemplative state, he snapped right back into his friendly. He checked his phone and then told me, "It seems like it's only going to be a few more minutes." So I put my little plan into action. I told the bloke that I had to grab a few things from my car just in case it needed a tow or I had to go anywhere, then slipped out of his car and walked towards my own. Once I was there, I put on a show of looking for things, and when what I was doing in actual fact was delaying time until his mechanic friend arrived. If it was some bloke in overalls driving his work van, then yeah, I probably had nothing to worry about. But anything else, I'd put phase 2 of my plan into action. I kept at it for a few minutes, fishing around for absolutely nothing while keeping my eyes glued to the road behind us. Then lo and behold, a big white van comes from around the bend a few hundred yards behind us, then starts pulling in behind the stranger's car. The van was all white, no marking on it at all, and it looked brand new. On top of that, there were 2 people sitting in the cab, not just one as I'd been expecting. Like I said, if everyone's intentions were good, then me acting a bit paranoid wasn't going to do anyone any harm. The mechanic and his friend might think that I was a bit weird, but weird I can live with. What I couldn't live with was the feeling I was walking into some kind of trap. The moment the van started to pull in behind the stranger's car, I hurried back to him and told him something like, "I'm just gonna nip for a wee. I'll be back in a few." At that, I scurried off into the trees at the side of the road and kept myself crouched and out of sight as if I was actually having a wee. But in actual fact, I'm just watching the seemingly kind stranger and his friends to make sure that they didn't have anything planned. I stayed where I was, telling myself I wouldn't move until I got a good look at the 2 blokes who'd just pulled up in the van. But the minutes ticked by and no one moved. Eventually, I heard the stranger's voice calling me from the side of the road. He sounded friendly at first, and just let me know that the blokes were working on my car. Only thing was, I could see a bit of my car, and there was no one standing near it. I still felt like I was going half mad at this point, that I'd gotten myself into a tizzy and had completely overreacted. Then, right as I told myself that I was gonna feel very silly after this if the guys really were there just to fix my car, the stranger's tone of voice changed dramatically. That alone sent a chill through me, but what truly terrified me was when he used my name. At no point in our conversation had we ever swapped names or introduced ourselves formally. I know that sounds a bit mental, since I was sitting with the bloke for the better part of a half hour, but my mind was on other things, and evidently his was too, because he never bothered to introduce himself either. I know there's always a chance that I let it slip during our chat and just not remembered it, but I certainly didn't know his name, which made it all the more frightening when he told me to show myself. He made it clear that if I didn't, it wouldn't be good for me, and that I might actually get to my mom's party on time if I just did as he told me. Squatting down among the clump of trees, trying to stay out of sight of those not-so-benevolent strangers, they made for the scariest few moments of my entire life. I didn't think it was possible to get any more frightened than that, but I was wrong. Suddenly, I heard an engine start up, but I knew from how healthy it sounded that it wasn't mine. The next thing, I see the stranger's car drive off, and that's the first stranger who picked me up, not the two strangers in the van. I thought that might mean that the van was about to drive off too, so I poked my head out from behind the trees a wee bit to get a better look. That's when I see a man, wearing a balaclava, walking through the trees with his head on a swivel like he's searching for me. Remember what I said about being wrong regarding how scared I could be? I can actually remember most of the stuff that happened, but after seeing that guy in his mask quite obviously searching for yours truly, my memory actually gets a bit spotty. I know I just ran, further and faster and harder than I ever ran in my life. I remember being sick a bit when I couldn't run any further, and I remember many cars passing me before a driver finally bothered to stop to see if I was actually okay. I also remember being frightened out of my wits that the first stranger or the guys in the van would come across me, but thankfully that didn't happen. Instead, I was driven to a police station where I gave a statement. After that came a trip to a mechanic's, which resulted in me finding out my car wouldn't be roadworthy for at least 24 hours. After that, I got a room and a bed and breakfast, got myself a late lunch, then cried on the phone to my mom up in my room. I actually think it was the single worst day of my life. I let my mom down, had to dip into my savings to pay for engine repairs, and it was just a complete nightmare of a day. And to top it all off, I almost got kidnapped or murdered as well. I just didn't think things like that happened in real life, or if they did, I certainly didn't think it had ever happened to me. I was able to give a really detailed description of the first guy along with what car he was driving, but as for the other two men, I didn't have much to say aside from what their van looked like. The police promised that they'd do all they could, and they even got the first guy in for questioning. But given that he hadn't actually broken any laws, they were unable to charge him with anything. The police had asked him about the masked men in the white van, but he just claimed he didn't know what they were talking about. According to him, he tried to do a favor to a young woman whose car had broken down, and the next thing, she's off into the woods in a blind panic. They let him go. But I know he was involved in it, and I know he only let me see his face because he thought I was a done deal. But if that's the case, how many other women and girls have his tactics worked on? And that's the thought I find myself living with after all these years. I can be thankful and grateful and whatever else I can be that I didn't end up a victim that day, but I can't be the only one. There have to be more. Girls who didn't get away. And it haunts me to wonder where they are now. I moved to South Korea for university when I turned 18. I'm now 21, and this happened over 2 years ago. Whilst there has definitely been unwanted attention from some guys in the past, most of them get the message that I'm not interested. This, however, was a little more unsettling. The university I go to has an institute for language, which is where all of my classes were at the time. And it's pretty common knowledge that most foreigners in this part of Korea would know of or study at this institute. It's not abnormal for me to receive random Facebook requests from guys wanting to learn English or make foreign friends, and most of the time I just ignore them unless we have a few mutual friends or I've met them before. I got a friend request from this guy named Nico, and we had quite a handful of mutual friends, and he'd messaged me too saying he was sorry for the randomness of the request, but he was just trying to make as many foreign friends as he could. I thought, what the heck, and I accepted and messaged him back saying it was no bother. From what I could tell by his Facebook photos, he was heavily pierced and tattooed and stated he was Japanese, but had studied in Canada and could speak good English, and also a foreigner studying at my university. After a few days, he'd messaged me again and I replied, and it was casual conversation, and he would often bring up maybe meeting for coffee or a movie, which I declined, until he started getting more aggressive for no reason. Every time I'd make a comment, he'd find some way to turn it into an argument, which grew tiring super fast, so I just ignored him. He'd often ask if I had a boyfriend, to which I'd reply no, and he'd bluntly say that we should be together. It was at this point where I decided I didn't really want anything to do with him, so I politely declined on the basis I didn't know him, we'd never meet, and we hadn't even known each other a week. He didn't take my refusal well, and began throwing insults at me based on my looks and saying overly graphic things that he'd do to me if he ever saw me. Apparently I was being stupid not to take him up on the offer, because I'd never do better than him and he'd make me see that. It creeped me out beyond belief, so I just blocked and deleted him on Facebook and tried to forget about it. I mentioned it to a friend of mine and she immediately knew exactly who I was talking about. Apparently I was not the first girl he added on Facebook and tried to bully into meeting him and being his girlfriend. After asking a few more of my friends who we'd had as mutual friends on Facebook, they'd all described pretty similar situations involving this Nico. One girl even told me that she'd given him the benefit of the doubt and met with him, and it turned out that he didn't even go to our university, but actually lived over an hour away and would travel there daily, probably to watch and obsess over which girl he would find on Facebook next. He told her he was born in America and had never been to Japan, yet he told me he was Japanese and studied in Canada, so who knows how much of what he said to anyone was actually true. I felt a bit freaked out by this, but tried not to let it bother me. I'd never see him around and I'd blocked him, so I forgot about it. And that was until about a week or two later I received a message from him on Facebook on another account saying how he'd see me that day at school. This shook me up a bit, since I hadn't even considered that he might actually be watching me at school. I ignored the message and blocked the account. A few days later, I got numerous messages from different accounts claiming to be Nico's friends, saying how he had his account hacked and could I please unblock him so he could explain and we could talk it over. I ignored these messages too, but I kept receiving more, all of which I am pretty sure were just Nico himself trying to reach out to me to get my attention. The more I ignored him, the more violent and aggressive the messages became, and I could tell that most of the time when he said he'd seen me, he was lying. He'd say things like, "I saw you today at the library all day, you fucking slut. You're a fucking four-eyed slut who can't get laid," and other messages to that extent. I knew he was clutching at straws because I never used the school's library to study, and although I wear glasses, I never wear them in public. So I just kept blocking the accounts and tried not to let it bother me, figuring he was just some desperate idiot. I figured he'd get bored of me soon enough and let it go. Until one day after classes had finished and I was browsing the small convenience store in the building to grab a drink on my way home. I opened up the fridge to get a bottle of water when I closed the door. He was literally standing right beside me. He didn't say anything, he was just staring at me. I hadn't seen him in person before because I had never agreed to meet him, but I knew straight away it was him. And I freaked out. I dropped the bottle and I just left the store. I didn't walk home because I was afraid he'd follow me and find out where I lived, so I just went back into school and stayed around areas where there were lots of people until a friend of mine came to meet me. After that, I saw him a handful of times when I'd leave class. He'd just be standing there doing nothing in particular, watching people as they walked past, and he'd stare at me intently. I'd made sure to always be with friends when I went to and from class and didn't go anywhere alone for a while, but after a week or so the messages stopped and I didn't see him again. The last time I heard from him was a year ago when he messaged me on yet a new Facebook account asking if we could be friends again because he'd changed and it was all just a joke. Needless to say, I ignored the message, blocked the account, and will not be taking up his offer on being friends. Okay, so back when I was in my 3rd year of uni, me and all my mates decided to go to this massive Halloween warehouse party as a group. For reference, we were 5 girls between the ages of 20 to 22. We all got dolled up in our various costumes, do some pre-drinking after meeting up in one of our flats. Then we get a taxi into the town center to head down to the club at about 11 at night. We get there, the music is great. Everyone looks lush, and aside from the steep drink prices, we were all having a better night. And then out of nowhere, some absolute bellend decides to ruin my night by harassing me wherever I went. I'm not one to turn down a drink or a dance if a lad is fit enough, but this wanker thought that it would be funny to act all creepy around us in a spooky clown outfit. And let me tell you something. I hate clowns. I'm serious. I'm 100% terrified of them. And I have been ever since I was a little girl. So for him to come up and think it's funny to actually scare me by making his mask stare at me was not my idea of a laugh. When I told him to F off, he kept saying, "Oh, come on, love, it's only a joke." But I wasn't in the mood for him, so I walked off to the bar and ignored him. After that, I kept noticing him looking at me from across the bar, keeping his mask on and staring at me because he knew it bothered me so much. I tried to just ignore him and focus on having a good time, but he really made it difficult and I never felt 100% safe. Later on that night, after a few more drinks, I started to need a wee, so I asked my friend to come with me to the toilets. I had to basically drag her away from the bar because she was chatting, and then just when we're outside the girls' toilets, she sees some guy that she'd fancied, so she asked me to wait a minute while I got his number. I tried to wait for her, I really did, but when I started to feel like I'd wee myself, so I just went into the toilets and found a cubicle. And this was later on at night, the last hour of the club night, so it was already emptying out and the toilets weren't that busy. I found myself a cubicle and then text my mate while I was having a wee to tell her where I was. I finish up, open the door of the cubicle, then walk out in the direction of the sinks to wash my hands, and then I see him. Clown Boy had just walked into the girls' toilets, still with his mask on, and he's making it stare at me again. There's no other girls in the toilets, and he's not laughing and trying to be funny like he was on the dance floor, and we're completely alone, and him just staring at me. He starts saying, "I was only joking, love. No need to be so uptight." And all this, but all I've got to tell him is to get out of the bloody girls' toilets and how he's a perv for following me into them. I'm trying to act all tough and angry, but inside I'm absolutely terrified, and I'm praying that another girl comes in and joins us soon. Thankfully, I didn't have to wait that long, and soon enough these other girls walk in and start berating this horrid clown boy for being in the girls' toilets. The noise then attracts one of the bouncers who radios his mates, and before long, the clown boy is being thrown out of the club for having gone into the girls' bathroom. I was buzzing, honestly. He seemed really angry at me and acting like it was my fault for getting him kicked out, but he couldn't do anything about it because he was basically being dragged out by the bouncers. What started as quite a scary situation ended up with a brilliant ending, because now I could enjoy the last hour before closing time without worrying about getting harassed. The club night finishes, but in the chaos of what spills out of the club and into the kebab houses across the road, I managed to lose all my mates. In the end, it's just me on my own, struggling to get a taxi, and because it's October, I'm freezing my nips off. None of the black cabs had their lights on, and the ones that did got snapped up before I could even get a word in. It started to look like I was going to have to walk home, which would take about half an hour, and since I was wearing heels and a miniskirt, there was no chance of that happening. It was either walk, stand around waiting for a taxi around sleazy lads trying to chat me up, or a third option. There was a lad I'd been dating on and off that lived in a flat quite close to the town center, a flat that was maybe only 5 minutes walk away from the club I was at. I could call him and ask him to sleep over, but the problem was that he might think it was something that it wasn't. That, and I was still into him when I honestly wasn't anymore. Point being, I was still in two minds when I actually called him, woke him up, and told him my problem. He said it was fine, that he'd get up and get me a blanket so I could sleep on his couch. Knowing I could leave the chaos outside the club felt like such a relief. Definitely not the kind of place you want to be as a girl on her own. But then, as I'm walking away, I feel a bit guilty worrying about where my mates are, so I'm calling them and texting them, trying to get a response out of any of them, but no one will reply to me. So, picture the scene. I'm drunk, wobbling in my heels, trying to get my mates and remember how to get to this guy's flat, all at the same time. It put my multitasking abilities to the test, but I just about managed it, right up until I saw someone sitting on some steps not far ahead of me. They looked quite young, about my age, and they were absolutely plastered. They were sitting on the stone steps of a building, but they were leaning up against the wall next to them, looking like they were just completely out of it. I instantly got a bit nervous about walking past them on my own, so I crossed over to the other side of the street and just tried to get past them without drawing any attention. But in my heels, with that bloody clacking, it was almost impossible just to walk past without the drunk man noticing. I knew the moment he saw me because he starts drunkenly saying, "Oi, where you going?" But it was so slurred that I thought he just sat there on the steps, slurring to himself. But then the next thing, he's shouting "Oi," even louder, and I look over my shoulder to see a lad who looked like he was half wearing a bowler suit from the waist down and who was carrying something in his hand. I couldn't work out what it was about him, but he looked oddly familiar, and it was only when he brought the thing to his hand up to his face that I realized what it was. He was carrying a mask, that same creepy clown mask that had been staring at me all night. It wasn't just some random drunk I'd been walking past. It was Clown Boy, and he was not happy to see me. I just kept walking at first, hoping that he was too drunk to follow me, but all it took was one look over my shoulder to see that he was. Granted, he was only stumbling towards me, trying to work one of his arms into his boiler suit costume thing, but he was definitely trying to follow. Again, my go-to move was to get bullshy, and I turned around to shout at him that if he came anywhere near me, I'd call the police and have him arrested. But that only seemed to make him laugh. His laugh in the club had been cringy, but now, with him being as drunk as he was, his laugh sounded all unhinged, a sound that was made even creepier when contained in the plastic clown mask that was creeping me out harder than ever. I tried walking as fast as I could in my heels, powering it towards a left turn that I knew I needed to take. I turned, acting like I was still going at walking pace, then I took off my heels and ran as fast as I could along the cold, wet pavement, hoping I could recognize where my date's flat was in the dark. I think that was the one move that saved me from something unspeakable that night, as Clown Boy didn't realize that I put some distance between us until we finally turned the corner and saw that I was running. He shouted again, but I didn't look back that time. I just kept going, keeping my eye out for the right apartment building. It felt like forever, but in the end, I spotted the right building, crossed over the road, then was almost at the buzzer when I felt it. This sharp, stabbing pain right in the center of my right foot, and I let out this really loud yelp of pain before basically hopping up the rest of the steps. I rang the guy's buzzer. He let me in, and I just about got myself through the big heavy door before I had to sit down and call him to come down and get me. As part of my black cat costume, I was wearing black tights that night, and there was blood just dripping off my heels as I was sitting down and holding my foot in the air. I didn't see it, but I knew what it was. I'd stood on some broken glass and it had cut me really, really deep. Weirdly, it didn't hurt at all, even though there were loads of blood and I knew it was a deep cut. I think the adrenaline just kept me going, that and knowing that I was actually safe. The guy ended up driving me to A&E at about 4:30 in the morning, and we had to wait in a waiting room that was almost entirely made up of other people in costumes who'd hurt themselves while drunk. The guy I'd been dating on and off stayed with me the whole time, even held my hand when it was my turn to be examined. I thought that I might just get away with stitches, but I ended up having to stay in A&E for hours because the doctors wanted to make sure that there was no leftover glass in my foot. Thankfully, there wasn't. The doctor had got it all out on the first exam, but then I needed to get my foot stitched up, so that was more hanging around and waiting for something that was really, really unpleasant. Finally, after about 3 hours of sitting around and getting treatment, I was free to leave. The doctor told me to stay off my foot for at least a fortnight, but other than that, I was okay. I ended up going back to Leeds to stay with my parents while I was healing up, but the whole time I've been texting Joe, the guy who'd given me the lift and had been so nice during such a horrible time. We agreed to go on another date when I got back, as I thought giving him a second chance after all that was the least I could do. And I think that's where our relationship really started. When I realized how supportive and loving he could be during a crisis, I'd been incredibly indecisive about any potential relationship with him, but that sealed it, and we've been dating for coming up on 8 years now. A bit of a weird origin story for a relationship, I know, but it makes total sense in my head. That run-in with Clown Boy was without a doubt the most unsettling and frightening thing that had happened to me during my university years. Probably the one time I ever truly felt unsafe in Sheffield town center. I'm still eternally grateful to Joe for everything he did for me that night, and I'm hoping he'll keep me feeling safe for many years to come.
This happened 2 years ago, when I was working for a very large carpet cleaning company. It's exactly what you'd expect. I'd spend the whole workday going from house to house, completely deep cleaning the residents' carpets with a lot of different tools and machinery. I was 22 and a female. I'm actually pretty sure I was one of the only females working for this company, but at the same time I really enjoyed it, and if I'm being honest, I was actually really good at the job. So, because of this, I was given a lot of work, and would usually hit between 6 to 8 houses daily, driving all across multiple towns. This night, I was working late, as one of the houses I cleaned earlier in the day took way longer than expected, which of course sent me back the rest of the day. I'd say it was around 7 p.m. when I had one house left to do for the day. Though, upon arrival at the given address, I quickly realized it was in the middle of nowhere. And after knocking on the front door, I also realized no one was home. I was annoyed, yeah, but realistically I was the one that was late for the appointment. I decided to wait until someone came home, as I knew I'd get chewed out by my boss if I left without cleaning anything. And luckily, 10 minutes later, the resident pulled up next to my van. He was a middle-aged man, balding, wearing dirty shorts and a jacket. He honestly seemed a bit awkward, but was apologetic and let me into his house with all my needed equipment. Upon entering, I instantly realized the carpet and just the house in general was already unbelievably clean. I mean, it even smelled like cleaning supplies had just been used. To be honest, it was a little weird. I wasn't used to seeing already clean carpets upon arrival. I was genuinely questioning whether me cleaning them would even make a difference. But regardless, I followed protocol and pulled out my company laptop to calculate how much it was going to cost before starting. Hey, do they keep track of where you are on that thing? His question caught me off guard. That was an immediate red flag. After the initial shock from the question, I replied saying that it did, and that my boss knew exactly how long each job should take. In reality, this was a complete lie. The laptop was literally just used to run a program that can calculate how much to charge a customer based on the inputted amount of work. But I felt like I had to lie, as there was definitely something off about this guy. Regardless, I started cleaning. I just figured the quicker I could clean these carpets, and the quicker I could get out of here and call it a day. Fast forward around an hour later, and I was finished. I hastily met up with the guy to explain I was done, and how much he owed me. But before I could, he interrupted me. He asked me if I could also clean his basement carpets, as he forgot to list them when he ordered the service. My heart literally dropped. I just wanted to be done with this and get out of here. But my stupid customer service conditioned brain couldn't figure out how to get away with saying no. The guy led me to his basement door, opened it, and gave me a hand signal as if to gesture that I was to go down first. I hesitated, but ultimately I did. Once I got to the bottom, I was horrified. The basement looked horrible compared to the rest of the house. Not only was it unfinished with no carpet whatsoever, but there were clearly 7 deep freezers lining the walls. In the middle of the room was a lit, low-hanging ceiling light revealing an old television set, VHS tapes scattered all over the floor, and an old recliner facing the TV. Behind the set were 2 white shelves full of VHS tapes. The whole while I'm looking at the basement, the guy stood at the top of the steps blocking the doorway with a disturbing smile on his face. I looked up at him and said, yeah man, let me go get my stuff. With absolutely no intention of cleaning anything, I just wanted to get out of there. I held my breath and began to walk back up the stairs. The whole while, all I could hear was my own heartbeat in my ears. But as I got to about the 3rd stair from the top, the guy was still blocking the door, with still that disturbing smile on his face. I stood there for maybe 20 seconds, just looking at the guy, waiting for him to get out of the way, when I swear I could hear footsteps in the basement behind me. Out of pure instinct and adrenaline, without even looking back, I charged towards the guy in front of me. Luckily, I was able to break past him, and right as I did, I beelined it out of the front door and into my van parked outside. I was leaving thousands of dollars of cleaning equipment behind. But honestly, in that moment, I didn't care. I legitimately felt like my life was in danger. As I was pulling away, I glanced back at the house one last time, and I saw the same man looking out one of the windows, now with no smile on his face, but rather a cold, hard stare. I thought I could see another person, but I honestly don't know. The whole memory is sort of just a blur. The truth of the matter is that my boss would not have noticed I was missing for at least 24 hours when I didn't show up for my shift the next day. The next morning, I would call my boss, tell him everything, and ultimately quit that very day. As far as I know, they got the police involved, but I try to distance myself from the whole situation, so I really don't know what ended up happening. I suffered PTSD over this experience. That day still haunts me. And to this day, I can't explain what I found in that basement, or the sounds of footsteps I thought to have heard behind me. But one thing's for certain. I believe that man, and whoever else was there, had planned to kill me that night for some sick reason or another.
I'm from a city in the northwest of my country called Garanuns. It's a very beautiful place. Some call it the City of Flowers. I love Garanuns, but I cannot live there anymore. There are too many bad memories for me, and people accuse me of something which I am innocent of. You see, 8 years ago I lived next to a family called the Negromontes. They seemed like very nice people, but they did not have a lot of money since the man of the house, Jorge, could not find a job for some reason. It was spoken in our neighborhood that Jorge could not work because of an illness he had, but he had helped support his family by making and selling pastries to his neighbors, including myself. Jorge made the best empadas and salgados, which are traditional Brazilian pastries that we all love to eat, and on more than one occasion, I found him knocking at my door with a tray of delicious empadas for sale. They were very affordable and very delicious, and I know I am not the only one in our neighborhood who used to buy them very regularly from him. It felt good to be able to help him support his family like that. Some people said Jorge was mentally ill, but it seemed obviously to be that he had some kind of physical condition too. Sometimes, when Jorge called over at my apartment, he would burst out laughing for no reason at all, like he had heard someone tell a funny joke that only he could hear. Sometimes his arms seemed to shake when he held out the tray of empadas for me to look at, and one day he started having a nosebleed which dripped all over the pastries. He apologized a lot and seemed very nervous as he walked away from my door, but when I assured him it was okay and that I hoped that he would feel better soon, he broke into this high-pitched laughter as he disappeared around a corner. Jorge could act very strange like that, but I just felt sorry for him and kind of admired how determined he was to support his family like that by working hard at making delicious food. But one day, I came home from my job to see a few police cars outside the Negromante house. All of the neighborhood had come out of their homes to see what was going on, and we were shocked when a forensics team showed up too. These are the police who wear the white overalls and masks, the ones who look for pieces of dead bodies when there had been a murder. There were many rumors about what the family had been doing, but we did not have to wait long to find out what was going on. The pictures were all over the newspapers one day, and everyone heard the story being told on the local radio and TV stations. Human remains had been found in the family's backyard, and they were identified as belonging to a local homeless girl named Jessica, who had gone missing sometime before. The news reports told us that the Negromantes had apparently lured her into the house with lies that they were looking for a nanny to look after their young child, but had then killed her and buried it in the backyard. We were all shocked by the news, but as time went on, even more disturbing facts were made public regarding the murders. I remember the day that the police had a press conference with journalists from all over the country. They claimed to have found a 50-page book that had been written by Jorge that he had titled Revelations of a Schizophrenic. The book was all about how he claimed to have been hearing voices talking in his head about how he should kill women, how what he did was all part of some kind of terrible satanic purification ritual, and that he had a plan to purify the world and reduce its population. I found this to be extremely disturbing and upsetting, as I would never have imagined that Jorge could ever think like this. He always seemed like such a sweet person, but I guess I was wrong to think that. But somehow, as the weeks went by, we heard things that were somehow even worse, things that destroyed my life as I knew it. Forensics teams had analyzed the entire Negromante house and discovered traces of the murdered woman's body tissue on cooking utensils used by the family. What's more, rather large chunks of flesh had been found to be missing from the bodies most recently buried in their backyard. Police could only come to one conclusion, that the family had been butchering the murdered women before cooking and eating their flesh. But what's more, rumors began to spread that not only had the family been practicing cannibalism, but they had actually sold some of the meat to the neighboring community in their empadas and salgados. It was horrifying to learn, as, of course, I had bought Jorge's pastries from him many times before, and not only had I eaten them, I thought they were very tasty. I remember sitting on my couch watching the TV when I heard the news. The room began to spin. I felt numb for a few moments, unable to properly compute the information that I had just heard, until it all became clear to me in one single horrible moment. I had eaten human flesh without my knowledge. I ran to the toilet and was violently sick. This was all traumatizing enough for me, but then rumors began to spread that the whole community was part of some satanic cult, and that we actually knew that we were eating it. People from all over the city came to our neighborhood to harass the people living there, including myself. Despite our denials, they called us all cannibals and told us that we were no longer welcome to live in Garonuns. I personally had a note posted through my door from someone anonymous telling me that I would be killed in revenge if I did not leave the city. I didn't want to risk my life, so I left for the coastal city very far away from Garonuns, where I currently live alone. I don't eat meat anymore. I am purely vegetarian because the taste of meat brings back horrible memories for me and makes me instantly sick every time I taste it. So, now you understand why I don't wish to give my name or give too much information as to where I live, as I'm afraid I'll be hunted by these people seeking vengeance for Jorge Negromante's terrible crimes. But I swear to Jesus Christ I did not know what I was eating, and if I ever did, I would not have eaten it, and I would have reported Jorge to the police. So please, although you think you might know who your neighbors are, ask yourself, do I really know who I'm living next to? Do I really know what they're doing behind closed doors? Because for some of us, we don't know exactly who our neighbors are. Not until it's far too late.
I was 13 years old when this happened on Halloween night in 2015. Since I had been sitting around all day, At 9 p.m., I decided to go for a walk out in the woods. It was one of my favorite things to do, since everything looked so different out in the dark and that there were no people around. I really loved the cool night air and the spooky feeling of the woods and the nearby pond. I'd started walking past my neighbor's blue house when they were having a huge Halloween party. There were flashing lights at the windows and music blaring, and I could hear all the drunk people raving in the yard. But soon enough, I had made it to the quiet woods like I had planned. As I was walking on the forest path, I started to feel very nervous and paranoid. I couldn't really see where I was going, and eventually had to take my earbuds off to be more aware of my surroundings. The feeling of uneasiness started to fade for a moment as I made it through the woods and onto a street near the one I lived on. I turned the corner back to my street, my earbuds back on, and blasting Nightcore, now almost relieved that I was almost home. I started to think I was being stupid for getting so jumpy over nothing. But then a thin figure appeared from behind the still lively blue house, and I immediately tensed back up. As the figure got closer, I placed my house keys between my fingers like I'd learned from the internet, and tried to make out what I was seeing. The figure was a man, fairly tall, bald, and wearing a black suit. He was also ghost white, and due to my poor vision, I literally almost shit myself thinking it was Slender Man himself coming to take me. A moment later though, I noticed that he did in fact have a face, and he had painted it to look like a skull. The man was obviously wasted, and he was staggering in a zigzag motion across the empty street right towards me. For a split second, I was hoping he was too hammered to even notice me, but that hope quickly faded as he made his way right to me. I was absolutely paralyzed with fear. My house was only 2 houses away, but I'd have to get past this unpredictable man, and I had no idea if I could outrun him with my asthma. Panicking, I was considering other ways to get away from him into safety. Could I turn back and maybe take a long way around to the other end of my street? No. It's dark, there's no one around, and I could definitely not run for that long. Can I make it to my grandma's house? Can't do that either. There's no guarantee that she's awake or even home. As I was trying to decide, my thoughts were interrupted as the man put a hand tightly on my shoulder. He started speaking, but I couldn't hear him properly due to my music still playing in my ears. All I managed to hear was him questioning what girl my age was doing out alone so late at night. I could only stand there and stare. The man then paused, raised his arm, and then pointed a finger to the woods behind the houses and then said something. It was at this point that I decided if I didn't do something, soon my body would definitely end up being found in the woods. I looked at the woods, then at the guy, shook him off, and broke into a full-on sprint past him at my house, crossing some of that blue house's property. At my front door, I was furiously stabbing my key into the old rusting lock with my shaky hands, fearing that any second that man would come grab me from behind and drag me into the dark forest on the other side of my yard. I finally managed to get inside and made sure the door stayed locked before I could finally breathe again. I threw my shoes off and made my way into the basement as my tears started rolling down my face. Sobbing, I had told my older brother what was going on, and together we called our parents who weren't home at the time. They said they would check it out, and we didn't call the police, since it was a little town and no harm was actually done. The next day, my dad had informed me that the drunk man was actually just one of the taxi drivers in our town, and we just never spoke of it again. It's 6 years later, and I still get extremely nervous going outside after dark, even though I don't live anywhere near that place anymore. I've told this story to my friends a few times, and it honestly sort of annoys me that I didn't get as much as an apology from that guy. I really honestly hate the whole town, and the fact that no one there does anything when things like this happen. I'm glad I live in a bigger place now, where we at least have street lights. I'm a 25-year-old female, and I had just bought my first home in December of 2019 in West Michigan. The neighborhood seemed quiet and safe, which I was pleased with, being that I live alone with only my dog to keep me company. Having a degree in social work and recently interning at the county jail has made me a bit jaded when it comes to local crime and the overall darker side of civilization. I've met quite a few of the surrounding neighbors, many of which are on the older side, and they all seemed pleasant. But of course, there's always that one loopy neighbor that has to ruin it. About a month after I moved in there was a knock at my door. I answered, and there was a man around his late 50s to early 60s waiting there. As I opened the door, he introduced himself. We'll call him John. John had a beard and was a little on the hefty side. It smelled of cigarettes, but overall looked like a pretty normal dude for his age. He told me he lived a few doors down and he had welcomed me to the neighborhood and said that he's a good handyman. So if I ever needed anything, I could let him know. I thanked him, and I thought it was nice to know that I had someone I could go to help for if there was an emergency. He asked if I lived with anyone, and I said no, that it was just me. It struck me as slightly odd that he would ask, but I figured I was just being paranoid. As the conversation ended, John said, "You know, you're a really beautiful girl." "Yeah, very pretty." And he smiled at me. I smiled back and thanked him, although shivers had run down my spine. After he left, I thought about his comment for a while. Had he been a decade or two older, it may have come off as more of a cute thing that an elderly man might say to a younger woman, but the way he said it struck me as quite odd. As the months passed, we casually waved to each other as neighbors normally do, but I didn't directly speak to him again until just a few weeks ago. Almost 1 year after our first conversation, I was raking leaves in the front yard, and I had my dog tied up to a tree so they could lay outside in the sun and watch me. My dog, whose name is Newton, is a mid-sized mixed breed of what I believe to be a border collie and some type of shepherd. I got him from a local shelter when he was just a pup. He's a real cutie, and he's very gentle and calm around me, but he can be quite protective, and he isn't always the fondest of males that he isn't familiar with. While I was raking the leaves, John comes over on his riding mower and starts to mow the unfinished side of my lawn. I was a little annoyed because I was right in the midst of learning how to take care of fall leaves for the first time, but I didn't let this show and just continued finishing up my patch. After he finished, he had hopped off the mower and he walked over to me and Newton. Newton's tail was wagging, but it was apparent that he was also a bit on edge. John and I spoke for a moment and I thanked him. Then John turns to Newton, and he puts his hand out. Newton sniffs his hand, and he begins to growl a bit. As I'm attempting to hush him, John proceeds to swat at his face in a playful gesture. Not a smart move to pretend to smack a dog who's visibly unsure of you. Newton then breaks out in an episode of nervous barking. Embarrassed and not wanting to annoy the other neighbors, I try and console Newton. Then to my surprise, this grown adult man gets down on his hands and knees in a child's pose position right in front of Newton and actually begins to whimper like a dog. I stared in disbelief, praying that no one else was watching this horribly awkward moment taking place. My eyes quickly dart to each surrounding house looking for witnesses and then stop on a woman that's watching us intently from John's side of the fence. John eventually gets up from the grass and he told me about his own dogs and that he also lives with his ex-wife in her basement. He went into all kinds of details about their marriage and how it didn't work out because he liked to party and she was more of a homebody. I assumed that his ex-wife was the woman who had been watching us interact from their yard. Before he left though, he had told me that he was moving out in the spring, but that he would be around in the upcoming winter to snowball my driveway if I'd like for $50 each time. I told him that I'd let him know, although I thought to myself that $50 was a bit steep for such a small driveway. After this conversation, I saw him once again last week when I brought my trash out. I saw him out of the corner of my eye waving to me from his driveway, but ignored him, not wanting to invite him into conversation as I was leaving for work soon. While walking back to my garage, I had heard him yell, "Hey there!" So I had no choice but to turn and give him a quick wave and nod. Aside from the whole whimpering like a sad puppy thing, he just generally gave me the creeps. And earlier today, my impression of him being an outright weirdo was reinforced. I was walking Newton around the block in the late afternoon. I started to shovel quickly when I came across John's house, hoping he wouldn't be outside, but of course he was, as he always coincidentally seems to be outside when I am. He yelled hello to me as he very swiftly walked out from his garage, and I very reluctantly paused by his mailbox and greeted him. "I broke my wrist," he sputtered out. I looked to see his right wrist was in a cast. "Oh no, how did that happen?" I asked. "I don't know," John said. I wondered how a person could totally be unaware of how they broke a bone. "I guess I'm just old. I'm probably about the same age as your dad, right?" John asked. "Yeah, probably pretty close," I replied. He then did his usual thing where he talks about things that I couldn't possibly care less about. Like about his new glasses and how he was also in the military, so he was able to get free gear from the VFW. He stuck out his hand to Newton again, and I had to remind him that Newton wasn't really fond of men that he didn't know that well. He offered to get Newton a bone, but I shrugged off the idea, not really wanting to prolong our conversation. "You know, we're supposed to get some snow over the weekend," John said. "Yeah, I heard about 6 inches. I replied shortly. I really loathe small talk, and I'm really horrible at faking interest in topics like the weather. "Yeah, well, I'll snowball your driveway for you if you want. I do Margie's driveway there in that brown house," John then says as he points across the street. "Oh yeah? You said it'll be around $50, right?" I asked. You know, I misspoke the last time we talked about it. We could work something out. Maybe $25 or whatever you can pay. I know times are tough because of the pandemic and whatnot. Or instead, you know, we could fool around or something." John stammered. I was a bit quiet for a moment, just trying to process his proposition, and I thought that there was no way I heard him correctly, or that he meant that in a sexual manner. "Yeah, I'll let you know, I guess," I said nervously. "So, do you have a boyfriend?" John asked. "No," I answered. I immediately kicked myself mentally for not telling him yes. I'm a horrible liar, though. It doesn't come to me naturally, which can really suck in these types of situations where it could be useful. "Well, do you want one?" John asked further. "Not really," I replied, laughing out of discomfort. "Hey, by the way, thanks for waving at me the other day. That was nice of you. I was trying to get your attention, and I didn't think you saw me," John said. "Yeah, no problem," I said, wondering why a wave meant so much to him. John began to speak about something else, and to be honest, I don't really remember what he said, because I was so wrapped up in trying to figure out his motive behind his last few comments. I ended up telling him to have a nice day, and started to walk away. "So yeah, just let me know about the snow blowing. If you can't pay me with cash, we can just fool around, and I would count that as even," he said from behind me, confirming his intentions. "Yeah, I don't know about that," I said sarcastically, not turning in his direction as I continued back home. "Oh, okay. Well, no big deal," John said in a weirdly friendly manner. I didn't respond, and the rest of the walk home I became pissed. Pissed that I didn't tell him I had a boyfriend or tell him to stay the hell away from me. Pissed at how he was so nonchalant and direct, and assuming that there was even a sliver of chance that I would be down to basically prostitute myself for what? A 40-minute shovel job? Pissed that I now feel uncomfortable inside and outside of my first home that I've worked so hard for. Pissed that so many young women, as well as men, are put in similar situations, or far, far worse. I'm sure there will be more to this story, seeing as I think he's going to try and clear my driveway this weekend without me even asking for his help. But for now, I'm just going to go to sleep with a knife right next to my bed. I'm also going to invest in some blinds for my bedroom, which faces direction, and I really hope he'll still be moving away in the spring, like he said he was.
I was 8 years old in the 3rd grade, and my younger brother Lucas was in kindergarten. Our school had 3 different lunch times: kindergarten and 1st grade, 1st period, 2nd and 3rd grade, 2nd period, and 4th and 5th grade, 3rd period of lunch. Once the first period of lunch was over, I remember we were doing a weekly assignment. Usually those take about 20 to 40 minutes to finish. 40 minutes later, right as I had finished it, I remember the dean's voice played on the speaker. He sounded scared and panicked as he said, "All students and staff, this is not a drill. Go in a lockdown." I felt worried and started to panic myself, as my somewhat cool and laid-back teacher seemed to panic as well and rushed to the door to lock it, close the blinds, and whispered to hide in the blind spot away from the windows. As we all sat in silence for what seemed like hours, we heard a knock on the door. A few girls and boys, including me, all jumped a bit. The slight knocking soon turned into loud banging. A few girls started to panic to only make the already scary situation worse. Minutes felt like hours for him to finally leave. After 15 minutes of hiding in pure terror, the dean finally came over the PA system telling us to walk in the single file line to the entrance of the school to be greeted by police. By the time me and my brother Lucas went into our mom's car, I looked to my brother. He was pale and looked around frantically. When we got home, I asked what was wrong and he said something that still scares me to this day. When that guy was pounding on my brother's classroom door, my brother peeked out from the sink. He saw a tall man looking through the window. He said his teacher literally pushed his head down frantically to hide him so he wouldn't be seen. He mentioned that the door had a window and it was barely covered. I also want to say that this was 2013, so I vaguely remember most of the details and had to ask my friend if he remembered the whole incident. I want to show you the layout of the school. The yellow line is where my class is. The red is where my brother's class was. Now we came to the conclusion that he either entered into where the orange line is or the blue line. To give you context on where those lines are located, the orange line leads to the back entrance, where there is a fence that is easily able to climb over. The blue line shows a way back between the school grounds and some houses. There's a tiny gate which is also easy to hop over. Now I want to clarify that those were assumptions on how he could have entered the school. If he went through the orange line, he must have went to my classroom, then hit a few more classrooms, then went to the kindergarten area, which is where my brother's class was. Or he did vice versa, if he were to enter where the blue line was. Since this was back in 2013, we don't remember if this guy was caught or not. But all I hope is that he was caught. Back when I was living on the streets, well, technically in my car, I would always post up by fast food restaurants because people would always give me their change or some of the food that they had recently purchased. One day I posted at the entrance of a plaza, and in that plaza the busiest place was a Chick-fil-A. Throughout the day, I received a few bucks and a lot of chicken nuggets. After being out there for a few hours, I noticed a car that left a few times and came back to park in the Chick-fil-A parking lot with covered license plates. But the person never got out of the car. Of course, I thought it was weird, but I didn't think anything of it. Throughout the day, I'd take my food to my car and I'd eat. Around 8 p.m., most of the plaza was closing up and the traffic started to slow down. Finally, when Chick-fil-A slowed down for a few minutes, a man in the car got out and he walked up to the door of the restaurant and took a picture of the inside. A few seconds later, what looked like the manager came outside, and it looked like she was arguing with the guy. She went back inside and the man got back in his car, got on his phone, and left about 5 minutes later. FYI, I was parked about 25 feet away from the Chick-fil-A parking lot and could see everything that was going on. So a few hours go by, and the place was closed. From the outside, it looked as if the employees were cleaning up. I was trying to fall asleep, then I saw that car from earlier pull up. Then it woke me all the way up. There were 2 cars left in the parking lot. His car and some other car. And some people left. The only person I saw inside was the woman that he was talking to earlier. I saw the man get out of his car at this point. He was wearing dark colors and with gloves on, and I saw the lights get turned off inside of Chick-fil-A. The man was standing on the side of the building by a dumpster, but in a way where he can't be seen. He was in the shadows. At that point, I leaned my seat all the way back so no one could see me. The woman walked out, turned around, and began to lock the door. As soon as she turned around, that man sprinted toward her, yanked her hair, and started to yell at her as he took her back inside. I leaned up a little bit to get a better look, but I couldn't see anything. There was nothing for about 10 minutes, until the man walked back outside. He went straight to his car, but instead of driving away, he drove up to the door and went back in with his trunk left open. A few minutes later, I saw something that I would never forget. The man was dragging the woman's body, but there was no head. He struggled to get her in the trunk, but eventually he got her there. He went back in there, and came out with a Chick-fil-A bag full of something and threw it in his trunk. He went back inside again for what seemed like 20 minutes. He came back out, locked up Chick-fil-A, and drove away. Someone else came back for the other car in the parking lot. A few days later, I went into a Starbucks to use the restroom, and on the news was a story about a missing woman. They showed the picture, and it was the woman who worked at Chick-fil-A. They were interviewing her husband, who was crying during the whole interview. What creeped me out is that her husband was the man that I saw with her that fateful night. I know he killed her, but he was on the news as if he didn't have anything to do with it, and like he doesn't know. Seeing that lady that night has haunted me since.
When I was around 10 years old, the most horrifying thing happened to me. I was still in elementary school at the time, and I was definitely no popular kid. I had a few acquaintances here and there, but I would overall not really talk to anyone. One day, my mom said that she was going to pick me up from school early that day, as we were going on a vacation to visit family that was about 6 hours away. That day, at around 1, I left school early and got into my mom's car. She had packed all the clothes, bathroom utilities, and stuff you would need for a long road trip. For the first few hours, I was listening to my iPad and eventually ended up taking a nap. Around, I'd say, the 4-hour mark, it was basically around 5 or 6 p.m., and it was getting dark fast, and we both were hungry and wouldn't be at our relative's house for a good 2 hours, so my mom and I decided to stop at a nearby Taco Bell. Not my favorite fast food restaurant, but I could live with it. We stepped inside and placed our orders, and once we got our food, we then sat down. So I'm sitting down talking to my mom about what we'd be doing once we got there, but she didn't seem too focused on what I was saying. She was looking over me in different directions as if she were worried or confused about something. I looked behind me but saw nothing and brushed it off as her being paranoid. So 10 minutes goes by and my mom says she has to step out to take an important phone call and that she'd be watching me through the window and that she'd be right back. So she's on the phone and I'm minding my business when I smell something extremely foul. I look to my left to see a man in his late 50s looking down at me. He said in a deep voice, "Hey young lady, my name is John, what's yours?" My mom was very strict about the whole stranger danger thing and I was taught never to talk to strangers. This guy was very often sketchy. He had a long gray beard, cracked yellow teeth, and looked like he hadn't been to the gym in years. He said again, "Come on, honey, tell me your name. I would love to get to know you." Just then, I saw my mom thankfully walking back into the restaurant, and he must have caught my eye and walked away. I decided not to tell my mom about any detail of what just happened, as she takes everything very seriously and told her we should go after she was done eating. A few minutes went by and my mom told me that if I had to use the restroom that I should go now as we had a long way ahead of us and probably wouldn't be stopping anywhere else. I got up and walked over to the restroom and opened the door. I was about to open one of the stalls when I heard a very familiar voice say, "Hey Rachel, wanna come over with me? I have some candy you'll like." I froze in fear and realized that it was the same man from earlier. I did not respond. I just simply walked out of the door, and my mom and I then left. However, as I was in the car while my mom was pulling out of the parking spot, I looked out the window and there he was. He was still inside waving at me with that creepy smile. I didn't look back and I didn't tell my mom. I have absolutely no idea as to what his intentions were. Why was he in the woman's restroom? What would he have done if he had gotten a hold of me? The part that still scares me till this day is how he knew my name. That still sends shivers up my spine just thinking about it till this day. I hope I don't see that creepy man again.
Back when I first moved away for college, my mom and dad bought me this beat-up old Toyota Matrix so I could drive home whenever I'd wanted. I grew to hate the old piece of trash after a while, but it got me from point A to B and it helped me get a job as a delivery driver for a pizza place, so I'll always appreciate the gesture. But then one night when I was making a delivery, something happened that meant that from that night on, I never got into the driver's seat of it ever again. So, like I said, I'm making deliveries one night, and I'd just gotten back into my car after dropping off a bunch of pizzas at an apartment building when I suddenly realized I hadn't locked the passenger side door. And the only reason I realized I hadn't locked the door was because this guy opens up the door and climbs into my car. Then right as I'm about to tell the guy to get out, I see he has a gun. I'm too scared to even say anything, and he just points it right in my face and says all out of breath, "Drive." As I'm pulling into the street, literally trembling in my seat, I see these two cops sprinting out of an alley in my rear view, and that's when it hits me that they were probably chasing him, and they probably had enough time to call in my license plate. Turns out I was dead right about that, because the next thing I know, I see flashing lights in the rear view. I didn't even have to look over at the guy. I just see him raise the gun up, pointing it at me, and he says, "If you stop this car, I'll blow your head off." So I drove and kept driving until we were out in the suburbs. The whole time the cops are tailing, and they're not shouting like "pull over" or whatever through their bullhorns or whatever you call it. And I figured it's because they know that the guy basically carjacked me and that there's a hostage situation going on. The whole time the guy's like, "Drive faster." And all I can say is, "I can't. This thing's a piece of trash. If I put my foot down, the engine might freaking give out." So he's content to just delay the inevitable for as long as he could. I don't know exactly how long we were driving because the little digital clock was busted, but after a while we started to see fields and stuff. Then my gas light starts blinking, and I tell the guy that if we don't at least try and stop for gas, that we were eventually just going to come to a rolling stop. He tells me to stop at the next gas station we see, so that's exactly what I do. But not before the guy uses his phone to call 911, telling the operator exactly what's going on, and to tell cops that if they come near the car while we're topping up our gas, he's going to kill the hostage, i.e., me. We eventually pull into this gas station in the middle of nowhere, and I'm absolutely terrified. But I ask him if he wants me to get out to top off the tank. He looks around and sees it's one of those pumps that stays locked unless you pay first, so he says no. But he has to think of something out before he lets me get out of the car. The cops are keeping a safe distance while this is going on, as they obviously thought the guy was straight up ready to kill me. And I'd be lying if I said I didn't think that too. The whole time they're shouting over their mics like, "Let the hostage go, we can work something out, and no one has to die over this, Malcolm. Just surrender, and we'll get you help." He's stalling the whole time, pointing the gun to my head every so often to warn the cops off, and I swear that every time he did it, I thought he was going to pull the trigger and just end it. But looking back, if he did that, the cops would have just swarmed the car and shot him, or at least I think they would have anyway. Then there came a point where I could see that he was trying to work out how to get out of the mess he'd gotten himself into. He knew he couldn't get out of the car to get the clerk to unlock the pumps, as they'd ran for cover as soon as they saw that it was a dangerous situation, and there was no way for him to get their attention. Then he seemed convinced that if I got out of the car, I'd run off to the cops, like, right away, which, to be fair, was my number one escape plan at the time. He asked me how far we'd go if we just took off with the gas I had in the tank, and I told him about a mile or two, not far at all. And he lets out this real deep sigh, like a balloon deflating or something, which I suppose was exactly what was happening. He was all out of ideas. He knew this was the end of it, and right then, I realized that was the point that he was at his most dangerous. I was pretty much convinced that I was going to die by that point, having gotten it into my head that the guy was going to just go out in a blaze of glory by shooting me and then unloading the rest of his ammo onto the cops. And then when I heard him say himself, "Screw it," and he did something to the gun, like cock it or take the safety off, I thought to myself, this is it. This is how my life ends, in a trashy car with some loser maniac. I shut my eyes, Felt my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard I could feel it shaking. And then bang. Only a second later, instead of feeling, well, nothing, I found I could open my eyes. But the first thing I saw when I opened them was a few specks of blood on the dash near the passenger side. Then when I turned, I instantly started dry heaving, because the guy had obviously put the gun in his mouth and pulled the trigger, because there was a ton of blood and chunks of brain matter all over the ceiling of my car. I opened up the door and was puking with my hands raised above my head while I heard the cops shouting, "Get down on the ground." I had to lie in my own puke, man. Just lie there while they ran over with their guns on me just in case I was somehow in on it. It sounds crazy, but I really didn't mind. Knowing it was all over, that I was safe, well, relatively anyway, it was all gravy by that point. Like, I don't even think I can really describe that kind of relief in actual words. I literally felt high off of it. You see and hear about people crying in the aftermath of stuff like that, and I guess that's just how they deal with the emotion. But to me, it kind of felt like I'd won something. Like I beat the carjacker by surviving or whatever. Anyway, I better sign off before this starts sounding too abstract, but I can definitely say I wouldn't wish that kind of experience on anyone, ever.